The Reckoning. Thaddeus Crane kept his head down as he navigated the crowded main hallway of Lincoln High School, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum tiles that stretched toward his first period calculus class. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows lining the eastern wall, casting long rectangular shadows across the floor, but Thad barely noticed the way the light caught dust particles suspended in the air, or how other students moved around him like water flowing past a stone in a stream. He'd perfected the art of invisibility over the past 3 weeks since transferring to Lincoln, a skill that required constant vigilance and a willingness to make himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable than his lanky 6-foot frame naturally allowed. His fingers gripped the worn strap of his backpack with more force than necessary, knuckles pale beneath sun-starved skin, and he counted the steps to his classroom door with the same methodical precision his grandfather had taught him to count breaths during meditation. The collision came without warning, though Thad should have anticipated it. A shoulder drove hard into his left side, sending him stumbling sideways into a bank of lockers with a metallic crash that echoed down the hallway and drew the attention of nearby students. His backpack slipped from his shoulder, spilling its contents across the floor in a cascade of textbooks, loose papers, and pencils that rolled in different directions. Laughter erupted immediately, sharp and cruel, and Thad felt heat crawl up his neck as he dropped to his knees to gather his scattered belongings. "Watch where you're going, Crane." Brock Sterling's voice carried that particular blend of amusement and contempt that Thad had come to recognize instantly. Brock stood 6 inches shorter than Thad, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, his broad shoulders and thick neck testament to years of football training and a weight room routine funded by his father's sports medicine practice. His blonde hair was styled with expensive product, his Nike athletic gear probably cost more than Thad's entire wardrobe, and his blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed watching others suffer. Or maybe you're just naturally clumsy. Thad didn't respond, just continued collecting his books with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, calm and patient even across the years since the old man's death. "Control is everything, Thad. Anyone can throw a punch. The real test is knowing when not to." He'd made a promise at the funeral, kneeling beside the casket with his grandmother's thin hand resting on his shoulder, that he'd never use his training to hurt someone out of anger or pride. That promise weighed heavier than any physical burden. "Dude's a ghost," Travis Connolly added, Brock's constant companion and a linebacker who followed Brock around like a loyal dog, hoping for scraps of approval. Travis kicked one of Thad's pencils further down the hallway, sending it skittering under the crowd of students who parted to give the confrontation space while simultaneously closing in to watch. "Doesn't talk, doesn't fight back, just takes it." Thad gathered the last of his belongings, pushed himself to his feet, with movements that were more controlled than they should have been for someone gangly and awkward, and continued toward his classroom without making eye contact with Brock or Travis or any of the 20-some students who'd stopped to witness his humiliation. His jaw ached from clenching his teeth, his left shoulder throbbed where it had impacted the locker, and his pride burned somewhere deep in his chest. But he kept walking. Behind him, Brock's laughter followed like a predator's growl, promising this was only the beginning. Calculus passed in a blur of derivatives and integrals that Thad copied mechanically into his notebook, his mind elsewhere, reliving the hallway incident and hating himself for not standing up, for not saying something, for choosing invisibility over dignity. His pencil moved across the page with unconscious precision, forming numbers and symbols that he'd process later when his thoughts weren't so fractured. The classroom smelled of dry erase markers and teenage body spray, fluorescent lights humming overhead with a frequency that seemed to match the low-grade anxiety buzzing through Thad's nervous system. When the bell rang for second period, Thad waited until most students had left before gathering his things and stepping into the hallway. The morning's confrontation had established a pattern he recognized from his previous school in Portland, the one he'd left behind 6 months ago, along with a reputation he'd spent 3 years building and 2 months destroying in a single violent incident that had resulted in a broken nose, 3 fractured ribs, and a court-mandated anger management program. His family had moved to Denver specifically to give him a fresh start, a chance to be someone other than the kid who'd hospitalized another student, and Thad had promised his mother through her tears that he'd changed, that he'd control his temper, that the martial arts training his grandfather had given him since childhood would remain a tool for discipline rather than violence. The following Monday morning arrived with fresh snow dusting the parking lot and a biting cold that turned breath to vapor. Thad pushed through the main entrance doors of Lincoln High School and immediately felt the weight of hostile attention settle across his shoulders like a physical presence. Brock stood near the trophy case with his inner circle gathered around him. Travis and Kyle Hendricks, another football player whose father owned a chain of car dealerships across Colorado. They watched Thad with the predatory focus of wolves sizing up wounded prey, and Thad felt his stomach tighten with anticipation of whatever they'd planned. He made it halfway to his locker before Kyle accidentally bumped into him again, this time from the front, driving his shoulder into Thad's chest, hard enough to stop his forward momentum. "Sorry, man," Kyle said with exaggerated innocence, his words dripping sarcasm. "Didn't see you there." "You're just so easy to miss." Other students flowed around them, most averting their eyes, a few watching with guilty fascination. Thad recognized the dynamic immediately. These people weren't cruel, just scared of becoming targets themselves, so they chose comfortable blindness over dangerous intervention. He couldn't blame them. He'd made the same choice countless times at his previous school before everything had imploded. "No problem," Thad managed, his voice quiet, and moved around Kyle toward his locker. The combination lock felt cold against his fingers as he spun through the numbers with practiced ease, opened the metal door, and reached for his chemistry textbook. Something wet and cold splattered against the back of his neck, and he froze as icy liquid ran down inside his shirt collar, soaking into his t-shirt. Laughter exploded behind him, and Thad turned to find Brock holding an empty water bottle, his expression triumphant. "Oops," Brock said, mock concern dripping from every syllable. "Butterfingers." Thad's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a moment he felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the muscle memory of his training flooding through his body like electricity through a circuit. He could see exactly how it would unfold. Step forward with his left foot, establish his base, drive his right hand forward in a straight cross that would catch Brock on the chin before the bigger boy could react, follow with his left hook while Brock was still processing the first impact, then step back and watch him fall. 3 seconds, maybe 4. His grandfather had drilled those combinations into his muscle memory over thousands of hours in the home gym, on the heavy bag, during controlled sparring sessions where control and precision mattered more than power. Instead, Thad grabbed his chemistry book, closed his locker with careful deliberation, and walked away, while cold water continued to drip down his back. Behind him, Brock's voice carried down the hallway. "That's what I thought." The pattern established itself over the next 2 weeks with methodical cruelty. Books knocked from Thad's hands as he walked to class, always from behind or from the side where he couldn't brace for impact, scattering his belongings across the floor while students stepped around or over him. Shoulders driving into him in doorways, timed perfectly to catch him off balance, sending him stumbling into walls or lockers with crashes that echoed through hallways. Verbal taunts delivered loud enough for surrounding students to hear, but quiet enough that teachers could pretend ignorance if they chose. "Nice shirt, Crane. Goodwill having a sale. And how's the weather down there in Loserville? And maybe you should try homeschooling. Oh wait, you'd need friends for that to matter." Thad absorbed it all with outward calm that would have made his grandfather proud, though inside he felt something beginning to crack. Hairline fractures spreading through his carefully constructed resolve like stress cracks in glass. He ate lunch alone in the cafeteria's far corner, his back against the wall, where he could watch the room the way his grandfather had taught him to maintain situational awareness, noting exits and potential threats with unconscious habit. The cafeteria smelled of industrial pizza and chemical cleaners, echoed with hundreds of overlapping conversations, and Thad focused on his food with artificial intensity while pretending not to notice the way other students looked at him, or didn't look at him, both equally isolating. Teachers noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Henderson in chemistry saw Brock shoulder-check Thad on the way to the lab stations, sending Thad's beaker crashing to the floor. Mr. Rodriguez in American history witnessed Kyle kick Thad's backpack across the classroom floor while Thad was at the front turning in an assignment. Principal Morrison had to have heard the rumors, seen the videos that students were recording on their phones and sharing on social media, with hashtags like #GreaterThanCraneWatch and #GreaterThanLincolnLoseServes. But addressing bullying meant paperwork and parent conferences and potential lawsuits if handled incorrectly, meant acknowledging that Lincoln High School's pristine reputation and award-winning anti-bullying programs existed mostly on paper rather than in practice. Easier to look away, to tell themselves that boys will be boys, that Thad needed to toughen up and stand up for himself, that if he just ignored it, the bullies would get bored and move on. By the end of the third week, Thad had become Lincoln High School's favorite punching bag, a role he accepted with grim determination, born from the knowledge that any alternative meant breaking his promise and potentially destroying his family's fresh start. The bruises on his shoulders and back formed a mottled purple-yellow map of abuse that he hid beneath long-sleeved shirts, even as October temperatures climbed into the 60s. His sleep suffered, dreams filled with violence both remembered and imagined, and he woke each morning with his jaw sore from grinding his teeth through the night. Friday afternoon of the fourth week found Thad in the school library during his free period, seeking refuge among the stacks of books where Brock and his followers rarely ventured. The library occupied the eastern wing of the school's main building, a large open space with tall windows that overlooked the parking lot and distant mountains. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes and giving the whole space a warm, golden quality that felt disconnected from the harsh, fluorescent-lit hallways beyond. Thad had claimed a corner table partially hidden behind the reference section, his chemistry homework spread before him, working through stoichiometry problems with methodical focus that helped quiet his thoughts. "Is this seat taken?" The voice startled him, and Thad looked up to find a girl he recognized from his English class standing beside his table with a backpack over one shoulder and a paperback novel in her hand. Piper Castellano had the kind of presence that drew attention without seeming to seek it. Dark, curly hair pulled back in a ponytail, warm brown eyes behind stylish glasses, dressed in worn jeans and a vintage band t-shirt that suggested actual music taste rather than manufactured identity. She stood maybe 5'6", athletic in that unconscious way that came from actual activity rather than social performance, and something in her expression suggested genuine interest rather than pity or curiosity. "No," Thad managed, then cleared his throat and tried again with more confidence. "I mean, go ahead. It's empty." Piper settled into the chair across from him with easy comfort, set her backpack on the floor, and opened her novel without immediately trying to start conversation. Thad appreciated that more than she could know, appreciated the simple companionship without pressure, the acknowledgement of his presence without demanding anything in return. They sat in comfortable silence for nearly 20 minutes, Thad working through his chemistry problems and Piper absorbed in her book, before she finally spoke again. "You're in Mrs. Chen's fourth period English, right?" Piper asked without looking up from her page. "I've seen you in the back row." "Yeah," Thad confirmed, still not quite sure where this conversation was heading or why Piper Castellano would choose to sit with him when dozens of other tables stood empty throughout the library. "I usually sit in back." "I noticed." Piper marked her place with a finger and looked at him directly, her brown eyes sharp with intelligence that suggested she saw more than most people. "You're very good at being invisible." The observation caught Thad off guard, and he found himself meeting her gaze despite his usual habit of avoiding eye contact. "Is that a compliment or an insult?" "An observation," Piper said with a slight smile that softened the edges of what might have been criticism, "though I think it's probably exhausting." Something in Thad's chest loosened at her words, a tension he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Here was someone who saw him, actually saw him, not as a target or a ghost, but as a person making deliberate choices. "It has its moments," he admitted, which felt like the most honest thing he'd said to anyone since arriving at Lincoln High School. They talked until the bell rang for final period, conversation flowing with surprising ease about books and music and movies, carefully avoiding topics like family or history or why Thad had transferred to Lincoln mid-semester. Piper had sharp opinions delivered with humor rather than judgment, made references to obscure bands and classic literature with equal comfort, and seemed genuinely interested when Thad mentioned his love of science fiction and his plan to study engineering after graduation. When they parted ways at the library entrance, Piper gave him a casual wave and said, "See you Monday," as if this might become a regular occurrence, and Thad found himself looking forward to Monday for the first time since his family had moved to Denver. The weekend passed slowly, as weekends did when you dreaded Monday's arrival, but also anticipated something potentially good. Thad spent Saturday morning in the small home gym his mother had helped him set up in the basement, running through forms and drills that his grandfather had taught him over years of patient instruction. The heavy bag hung from a reinforced ceiling beam, its leather surface worn smooth from thousands of strikes, and Thad worked it methodically, jab, cross, hook, jab, cross, hook, his combinations flowing with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. Sweat soaked through his t-shirt, his knuckles ached inside his bag gloves, and his legs burned from maintaining proper stance and footwork. But the familiar rhythm quieted the chaos in his mind. His grandfather had been a Marine, then later a boxing coach at a community center in Portland, and had recognized something in young Thad that needed channeling. "You got fire in you, boy," the old man had said when Thad was 9 years old, small for his age and bullied at his elementary school. "Fire's good, but only if you control it. Otherwise it just burns everything down, including you." So began years of training in boxing first, then later Brazilian jiu-jitsu when his grandfather decided Thad needed to learn control on the ground as well as standing. The old man had been strict but fair, demanding discipline above all else, teaching that martial arts existed for self-defense and self-improvement rather than aggression or domination. Then had come the incident at Thad's previous school, when a bully named Connor Michaels had pushed too far, had cornered Thad in the locker room after PE and thrown the first punch, and Thad's carefully maintained control had shattered like glass. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, but the damage took months to heal. Connor's broken nose and fractured ribs, the criminal charges that were eventually reduced to misdemeanor assault after witnesses confirmed Connor had initiated violence, the suspension and mandatory counseling, and his grandfather's disappointment that hurt worse than any legal consequence. The old man had died 3 months later, cancer that had been spreading silently for years, and Thad had knelt beside his hospital bed and promised, sworn on everything he held sacred, that he'd never lose control again, that he'd honor everything his grandfather had taught him about discipline and restraint. Monday morning brought rain, cold and steady, turning Lincoln High School's parking lot into a maze of puddles and running water. Thad pushed through the main entrance with his jacket hood up, shaking off droplets, and made his way through crowded hallways toward his locker. He'd almost reached it when someone's foot shot out from behind a cluster of students, catching Thad's ankle and sending him sprawling forward onto the wet tile floor. His palms hit first, skidding slightly, then his knees, then his chest, driving the breath from his lungs with a painful whoosh. Laughter erupted immediately, and Thad looked up through wet hair to find Brock standing over him with his phone out, recording. "Graceful," Brock commented, his tone suggesting he'd found this hilarious. Around them, other students had their phones out too. At least a dozen screens pointed at Thad like he was performing for their entertainment. Somebody should teach this kid how to walk. Thad pushed himself to his feet with slow deliberation, his palms stinging where they'd scraped across the floor, and bent to pick up his backpack. His face burned with humiliation that he couldn't quite mask, and he saw Brock's smile widen as the phone captured every moment. This was the new pattern, Thad realized, not just harassing him, but documenting it, creating content for social media, turning his suffering into entertainment that could be shared and reshared and commented on by strangers. The digital age had made bullying a spectator sport. "Keep walking, Crane," Kyle called from somewhere behind Brock. "Maybe try not to trip over your own feet next time." Thad walked away without responding, but he felt the weight of those phone cameras following him, felt the exposure of his humiliation being broadcast to the entire school. By lunchtime, the video had made it to Instagram and Snapchat, tagged with Lincoln High School's location and a mocking caption that Thad didn't read, but heard about secondhand from students whispering and laughing as he passed. He ate lunch in the library again, but Piper found him there, slid into the chair across from him with her own lunch bag, and said nothing about the video, though they both knew she'd seen it. "So," Piper said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for several minutes, "I've been meaning to ask. You new to Denver?" Thad hesitated, weighing how much truth to offer, then settled on a version that satisfied without revealing everything. "We moved here over the summer, from Portland. My mom got a better job opportunity." "Like it so far?" Piper's question seemed innocent, but her eyes held that knowing quality again, suggesting she'd already guessed at least part of the answer. "The mountains are nice," Thad said, which was true and also completely avoided the real question. "Portland's pretty flat by comparison." Piper smiled like she understood exactly what he wasn't saying, and steered the conversation towards safer topics, music recommendations, a movie she'd watched over the weekend, a book she thought he might enjoy. Thad found himself relaxing despite the morning's humiliation, found himself laughing at Piper's dry observations about their English teacher's obsession with symbolism in every piece of literature. When the bell rang for fifth period, Piper gathered her things and paused beside his table. "Hey," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling things really well. Better than most people would." The comment caught Thad unprepared, and he wasn't sure how to respond except with a mumbled thanks that felt inadequate. Piper gave him a quick smile and headed toward the library exit, leaving Thad to process the strange combination of warmth and guilt her words had triggered. She thought he was handling things well, but if she knew why he was handling them, if she knew what he was capable of and chose not to do, would she still think the same? The week progressed, with escalating harassment that followed a pattern Thad recognized from countless anti-bullying videos and school assemblies that pretended to address problems they didn't really want to confront. Tuesday brought his locker vandalized with permanent marker. crude insults and stick-figure drawings that maintenance had to clean. Wednesday featured his backpack stolen from the gym locker room during PE, found later in the trash can outside the cafeteria with his textbook stained by someone's spilled soda. Thursday morning, he arrived at school to find someone had created a fake Instagram account in his name, posting embarrassing photos and weird captions designed to further isolate him socially. Each incident was witnessed by dozens of students, many with phones recording, but no one intervened and no teachers seemed willing to address the obvious pattern of targeted harassment. Friday brought the cafeteria incident that would mark a turning point. Though Thad didn't know it at the time, he'd been standing in the lunch line, plastic tray in hand, waiting to reach the hot food section, when Brock accidentally bumped into him from behind. The collision sent Thad stumbling forward into the student ahead of him, who spilled their drink, who then turned to yell at Thad for being clumsy. Before Thad could apologize or explain, someone else bumped him from the side, sending his empty tray clattering to the floor, and suddenly there was a domino effect of collisions and spills, and angry students all blaming Thad for the chaos. "Jesus Christ, Crane, watch where you're going!" a sophomore girl snapped as orange juice stained her white sweater. "This is brand new." "I didn't," Thad started, but his words were drowned out by other complaints and accusations. Behind them all, Brock and his friends watched with barely contained laughter, phones out and recording the scene they'd orchestrated. Thad felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, felt his jaw clenching and his fists tightening at his sides, felt the training his grandfather had drilled into him, flooding his awareness with possibilities. Step forward, establish base, control the space, assert dominance. Instead, he bent to pick up his tray from the floor, where someone immediately stepped on his fingers, heavy sneaker grinding down before he could pull his hand away. Pain shot up his arm, sharp and electric, and Thad bit the inside of his cheek to keep from crying out. By the time he'd retrieved his tray and regained his feet, the lunch line had closed ranks against him, treating him like a pariah who deliberately caused chaos. He bought a bag of chips and a water bottle from the vending machine instead, and retreated to his usual corner table, while Brock's laughter followed him across the cafeteria. Piper found him there 10 minutes later, sliding into the seat across from him without invitation or preamble. "That was orchestrated," she said flatly, her tone carrying anger on his behalf that Thad couldn't quite let himself feel. "Everyone saw it. Brock set you up." "Doesn't matter," Thad said quietly, focused on opening his bag of chips with fingers that ached from being stepped on. "No one's going to say anything." "I would," Piper insisted, her brown eyes flashing with conviction that felt dangerous in its sincerity. "I'd go to Principal Morrison right now and tell him everything, and Brock's dad would call his lawyer, and suddenly you're being accused of making false accusations, and the school would investigate but find insufficient evidence, because somehow all those phone videos would disappear, and meanwhile you'd become a target too." Thad spoke from experience, remembering how things had unfolded at his previous school, how the system protected bullies with resources while punishing victims who fought back. Better to just keep your head down. "That's what they want you to think," Piper argued, but something in Thad's expression must have conveyed the futility he felt because she changed tactics. "Fine. Then we'll handle it differently. You're eating lunch with me and my friends starting Monday. Not in this corner where you're isolated, but at our table by the windows. Let's see them try shit when you're surrounded by witnesses who'll actually speak up." The offer caught Thad off guard, and he found himself studying Piper's face for signs of pity or charity or whatever other motivation might drive someone to extend such kindness. But her expression held only determination and something that might have been recognition, one outsider acknowledging another. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because I've been where you are," Piper said simply. "Different school, different circumstances, but same bullshit. And because someone helped me then, so now I'm paying it forward. Also, you seem genuinely nice." and those are in short supply around here. Thad felt something shift in his chest, some combination of gratitude and guilt and fear that he might be bringing trouble to someone who didn't deserve it. But he also recognized the gift she was offering: connection, alliance, evidence that he wasn't completely alone in this building full of people who'd chosen comfortable blindness. "Okay," he said finally. "Monday. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Piper said with a wry smile. "My friends are weird. You've been warned." That weekend, Thad trained harder than he had in months, pushing himself through brutal conditioning routines that left him gasping and shaking on the basement floor. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory during every burpee and push-up and mountain climber. "Pain is just information, boy. Your body telling you where your limits are, but limits can be pushed, expanded, if you're willing to do the work." Thad did the work, welcomed the physical exhaustion that left no energy for anxiety or anger or fear about Monday. After conditioning, he worked the heavy bag again, practicing combinations with technical precision that his grandfather would have critiqued and approved. Left jab to set up distance, right cross driving from the hip with full body rotation, left hook sweeping around the guard, right uppercut if they dropped their hands. Each combination flowed into the next with efficiency that came from 10,000 repetitions, muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Sunday evening, he helped his mother with dinner, chopping vegetables while she prepared chicken, their kitchen filled with comfortable sounds of cooking and easy conversation. His mother had aged in the months since his grandfather's death and the incident at his previous school, new lines etched around her eyes and mouth, grey threading through her dark hair. She worked as a medical office manager now, long hours but better pay than Portland, and Thad knew she'd taken the Denver job primarily to give him a fresh start. He hated that he was failing to capitalize on that gift, hated that he was once again becoming a victim instead of the confident young man his grandfather had worked so hard to develop. "How's school going?" his mother asked with careful casualness that suggested she'd heard rumors or seen signs of problems but wasn't sure how to address them. "Making friends?" "Yeah," Thad lied, because telling her the truth would only add to her stress and worry. "There's this girl Piper from English class. She's cool, likes a lot of the same music I do." His mother smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her fatigue. "That's wonderful, honey. You should invite her over sometime. I'd love to meet your friends." Thad promised he would, knowing he probably wouldn't, and they finished preparing dinner in companionable silence before eating together at the small kitchen table. Later, lying in bed with his ceiling fan creating hypnotic shadows across the walls, Thad thought about Piper's offer and felt anxiety mixing with anticipation. Tomorrow would be different. He'd sit with her and her friends, would be visible instead of invisible, would declare through simple action that he refused to be completely isolated. But visibility meant vulnerability, meant exposing himself and anyone associated with him to whatever Brock and his followers might plan next. The alternative was worse, though. The alternative was disappearing completely, becoming so good at invisibility that he ceased to exist even to himself. His grandfather would never have accepted that. "Stand up straight, boy," the old man had said 1,000 times during their training sessions. "You take up space in this world just like everyone else. Don't apologize for it. Just be ready to defend it if necessary." Monday morning arrived with clear skies and unseasonably warm temperatures that felt wrong for late October. Thad pushed through Lincoln High School's main entrance and navigated the crowded hallways with his usual caution, hyper-aware of his surroundings in ways that other students couldn't understand. He made it to first-period calculus without incident, then through second-period Spanish and third-period chemistry, the morning passing in a blur of lectures and note-taking that kept his mind occupied. When the lunch bell rang, Thad felt his anxiety spike, his palms growing damp as he gathered his things and headed toward the cafeteria. Piper waited near the entrance, waving when she spotted him, and together they navigated through the crowded space toward a table by the large windows that overlooked the student parking lot and distant mountains. 4 students already occupied chairs around the table, 2 girls and 2 guys, who looked up with varying expressions of curiosity and welcome as Piper and Thad approached. "Everyone, this is Thad," Piper announced, settling into a chair and gesturing for Thad to take the empty seat beside her. "Thad, this chaotic crew is Maya, Jordan, Chris, and Alexis." The introductions blurred together as Thad tried to process names and faces while simultaneously scanning the cafeteria for Brock and his followers. Maya had purple streaks in her black hair and wore band t-shirts similar to Piper's style. Jordan was a tall Asian kid with expensive headphones around his neck and easy confidence in his posture. Chris looked like he should be on the football team with Brock, but dressed more like an art student, with paint-stained jeans and multiple rings on his fingers. Alexis had short blonde hair and runner's build, her eyes sharp and assessing as she studied Thad with obvious curiosity. "Piper says you're into sci-fi," Jordan said, diving immediately into conversation with enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than performative. "Please tell me you've read the Expanse series." The lunch period passed with surprising ease as Thad found himself drawn into conversation about books and movies and music, discovering that Piper's friend group shared his interests and engaged with them in thoughtful ways that transcended typical teenage posturing. He learned that Maya played guitar in a local punk band, that Jordan was obsessed with film theory and wanted to study at USC, that Chris painted and had won several regional art competitions, that Alexis competed in cross-country and harbored secret love for trashy reality TV. They asked about his interests without prying into his history, made space for him without making a big production of it, and gradually Thad felt some of the tension he'd been carrying begin to ease. Across the cafeteria, Thad spotted Brock watching their table with an expression that suggested he'd noted this development and filed it away for future use. Travis sat beside him, leaning in to whisper something that made Brock smile. Not a friendly smile, but the calculated expression of someone planning their next move. Thad felt his stomach tighten with dread, knowing instinctively that eating lunch with Piper and her friends had just escalated the situation, had transformed his solitary suffering into something that might now endanger people who'd only tried to show him kindness. "Ignore them," Piper said quietly beside him, apparently reading his expression. "They're cowards. They only go after people who are alone." Thad wanted to believe her, but knew from experience that bullies didn't follow logical rules, that their calculations included cruelty variables beyond normal social constraints. He said nothing, just finished his lunch while trying to participate in the conversation flowing around him, aware that he'd just made a choice with consequences he couldn't yet predict. The following Wednesday brought the first sign that Piper had miscalculated. She emerged from the girls' bathroom between 3rd and 4th period to find her locker vandalized with permanent marker similar to how Thad's had been. Crude insults about her appearance and suggestions that she liked losers and needs better standards. The damage required administrative intervention to clean, and Piper stood beside Principal Morrison with arms crossed and jaw set as he offered meaningless platitudes about school policy and zero tolerance, while doing exactly nothing to investigate or punish the obvious perpetrators. "This is about Thad, right?" Piper said, after Morrison had walked away, turning to face Thad, where he stood nearby with guilt churning in his stomach. "They're targeting me now because we're friends." "I'm sorry," Thad managed, the words feeling pathetically inadequate. "I should have stayed invisible." "This is my fault." "Shut up," Piper said, but without real heat. "This is Brock's fault and his asshole friend's fault, and every teacher and administrator who's seen what's happening and done nothing. Not yours. You didn't ask to be harassed. But Thad couldn't shake the feeling that he'd brought this on her, that his mere presence was toxic enough to contaminate anyone who showed him kindness. The guilt consumed him for the rest of the day, through fourth period English, where he couldn't focus on Mrs. Chen's lecture on metaphor and symbolism, through fifth period history, where dates and events blurred together meaninglessly. After final bell, he found Piper waiting by his locker, her expression determined despite the morning's vandalism. "Walk me to my car?" she asked, and Thad nodded, gathering his books and following her through the thinning crowd of students toward the parking lot. The afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement, and a cool breeze carried hints of approaching winter. They walked in silence until they reached Piper's elderly Honda Civic, parked in the far corner of the student lot, and she turned to face him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm not scared of them," Piper said firmly, preempting whatever apology or excuse Thad had been preparing. "And I'm not going to stop being your friend just because some entitled jerks think they can dictate who I spend time with. So you can stop feeling guilty, and we can figure out together how to handle this." Something in Thad's chest loosened at her words, not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, a recognition that perhaps he didn't have to face this completely alone. "They won't stop," he said quietly, voicing the truth they both knew. "It's only going to get worse." "Probably." Piper agreed with that same unflinching honesty that characterized most of her conversation. "But I'd rather deal with worse, alongside someone decent, than pretend I don't see what's happening." "That makes sense." Thad nodded, not trusting his voice, and Piper gave him a quick smile before climbing into her car. He watched her drive away, then started the 20-minute walk to his own house in the subdivision 2 miles from school. His family couldn't afford a second car yet, and Thad didn't mind the exercise, use the time to process his thoughts and decompress from the day. The walk took him through residential streets, lined with modest homes and mature trees, past a park where younger kids played on swings and slides, and he tried to let the familiar routine quiet his mind. That evening in the basement gym, Thad worked through grappling drills on the mat his grandfather had installed years ago when they'd lived in Portland and hauled with them to Denver. He practiced escape techniques and submissions, visualizing opponents with Brock's face and Travis's build, working through scenarios with technical precision that kept emotion separate from execution. His grandfather had emphasized that distinction constantly during training. "You don't fight angry, boy. Anger makes you stupid, makes you wild. You fight calm, calculated, using your opponent's aggression against them. That's how someone small beats someone big, how someone skilled beats someone strong." By the time Thad finished training and showered, his body ached with that good exhaustion that came from pushing limits, but his mind still churned with anxiety about what tomorrow might bring. He tried to distract himself with homework, lost himself in calculus problems where answers were definitive and provable, where X always equaled a specific value if you followed the correct steps. Math offered comfort that human interaction never could. Clear rules, consistent logic, problems that could actually be solved. Thursday morning arrived with heavy clouds threatening rain, and Thad pushed through Lincoln High School's main entrance to find Brock and his crew gathered near the trophy case, clearly waiting. They tracked his movement across the hallway with predatory focus, and Thad felt his muscles tense in anticipation, but no confrontation came during the morning rush. He made it to his locker, retrieved his books, and headed toward first period calculus, while trying to ignore the feeling of eyes boring into his back. The attack came between second and third period, when the hallways were most crowded and adults were least present. Thad had just closed his locker and turned toward his chemistry class when someone shoved him hard from behind, sending him stumbling forward into the flow of students. Before he could regain his balance, another shove came from his left, then one from his right, and suddenly he was being bounced between multiple people like a pinball, while laughter erupted around him. His backpack was ripped from his shoulder, the contents dumped across the floor, and Thad found himself on his hands and knees, scrambling to collect scattered textbooks and loose papers, while dozens of feet stepped around or deliberately on his belongings. "Oops! Did you drop something, Crane?" Brock's voice came from somewhere above him, thick with mockery. "You're always dropping stuff. So clumsy." Thad kept gathering his things with hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts to remain calm, his face burning with humiliation, very aware that multiple phones were recording this scene for later distribution. He'd almost collected everything when a foot connected with his ribs, not hard enough to seriously injure, but forceful enough to drive the breath from his lungs and send a spike of pain through his torso. Thad gasped, tried to push himself upright, and felt hands shoving him back down before he could stand. "Stay down there, Crane," Kyle's voice added to the chorus. "That's where you belong." Thad's vision narrowed, edges going dark, and he felt something primal rising in his chest. Rage or desperation or both, the same wildness that had exploded out of him in Portland when Connor Michaels had cornered him in the locker room. His muscles tensed, his training flooding his awareness with defensive options, ways to sweep the legs of whoever stood closest, ways to stand and establish distance and end this humiliation with definitive violence. He could drop Kyle with a liver shot, could put Travis on the ground with a leg sweep, could drive his fist into Brock's solar plexus hard enough to leave him gasping and afraid, and Thad! Piper's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent, and Thad looked up to find her pushing through the crowd of onlookers. She knelt beside him, started helping collect his scattered belongings with hands that moved quickly and precisely, her presence breaking the spell of violence that had been building in his mind. "Come on, let's get your stuff and get to class." The crowd began to disperse as a teacher's voice called out from down the hallway, asking what was happening, though they'd conveniently arrived too late to witness any actual harassment. Brock and his friends melted into the flow of students heading to class, leaving Thad and Piper alone in the now empty hallway with his scattered possessions spread across the floor. They gathered everything in silence, Thad's hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline and suppressed rage, and didn't speak until they'd reached the chemistry classroom, where Mr. Carter barely glanced up from his computer as they entered late. "Thanks," Thad whispered as they slid into their lab station, the word feeling completely inadequate for what Piper had just done. Not just helping him collect his things, but pulling him back from the edge of doing something that would have destroyed everything his grandfather had taught him. "They're escalating," Piper observed quietly while Mr. Carter began his lecture on chemical bonds. "That was worse than just bumping into you or knocking your books down. They're getting physical." Thad knew she was right, could feel the pattern of escalation following predictable trajectories he'd seen before. Bullies who got away with minor harassment inevitably pushed boundaries further, testing how much they could do before facing consequences. And since Lincoln High School's administration had made clear they wouldn't intervene, the only real limit was how far Brock and his friends were willing to go. "I know," Thad said quietly. "I know." "You need to talk to Principal Morrison," Piper insisted, her voice low but urgent. "Or your parents. Or someone. This isn't sustainable." "And say what?" Thad asked, the question rhetorical because they both knew the answer. "That I'm being bullied, but I never fight back or even really defend myself, so maybe I'm just oversensitive or attention-seeking? That students are recording me on their phones, but somehow no evidence ever surfaces when I need it? That teachers see it happening but claim they didn't notice anything actionable?" He shook his head, bitter resignation in every word. "The system doesn't work for people like us. It works for people like Brock, whose dad can afford lawyers and makes big donations to the athletic department." Piper didn't argue, perhaps because she'd seen enough of the world to know he was right. They worked through the chemistry lab in silence, titrating acids and bases, while around them other students chatted and laughed like this was just another ordinary Thursday. For them, it probably was, Thad reflected. Most people move through the world without experiencing targeted harassment, without understanding how it felt to be constantly hypervigilant, to calculate exit routes and potential threats, to weigh every social interaction for hidden dangers. They got to just exist, while Thad had to strategize his existence. Friday brought a temporary reprieve as Brock and his crew focused their attention elsewhere. Some drama involving the football team and accusations of cheating on a history exam that occupied social energy that might otherwise have been directed at Thad. He ate lunch with Piper and her friends, participated in conversations about weekend plans and upcoming Halloween parties, and allowed himself brief moments of near normalcy that felt fragile as spun glass. Jordan invited him to catch a movie on Saturday, and Thad agreed before his anxiety could manufacture reasons to decline, aware that refusing opportunities for connection would only strengthen his isolation. The weekend provided breathing space. Saturday's movie outing with Jordan and Chris evolved into dinner afterward at a local burger place, conversation flowing easily around topics like upcoming blockbusters and ranking superhero movies, and debating whether the book was always better than the film adaptation. Thad found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, felt some of the constant tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. These people weren't pitying him or treating him like a charity case. They were just being friends in the natural, unforced way that good friendship manifested. Sunday evening, Thad's phone buzzed with a text from Piper. Group chat, followed by an invitation to join a messaging thread with her and the rest of the lunch table crew. The conversation was already in progress, Maya sharing a video of her band's recent practice session, Alexis complaining about her coach's new conditioning regimen, Chris posting a photo of a painting in progress. Thad watched the messages scroll by for several minutes before adding his own comment about Maya's band, and the easy acceptance of his contribution felt like another small victory against the isolation Brock had been constructing around him. The second month of Thad's time at Lincoln High School arrived with November cold and early darkness, days shortening as winter approached. He'd settled into a routine that balanced caution with connection, eating lunch with Piper's group, exchanging messages in the group chat, even agreeing to attend a Halloween party at Maya's house, where he stood awkwardly for the first hour before Chris drew him into a debate about classic horror films that lasted until Thad forgot to be self-conscious. Small normalcies accumulated like armor against Brock's harassment, which continued but felt less devastating when buffered by genuine friendship. The Monday before Thanksgiving, Thad arrived at his locker to find it had been broken into, the lock damaged, and door hanging open. His gym bag was missing, the one containing his hand wraps and boxing gloves, items he'd kept in his locker because carrying them around all day attracted questions. The theft itself bothered him less than what it represented. Brock's crew had been in his locker, had seen evidence of his training, would now be asking questions about why a kid who got pushed around without resistance owned boxing equipment. "Looking for something, Crane?" Brock's voice came from behind him, and Thad turned to find the bigger boy leaning against the wall nearby, arms crossed, expression smug. "Maybe you should be more careful about your belongings. Things have a way of disappearing around here." Thad said nothing, just examined his damaged locker, and calculated whether he should report the theft to administration, knowing they'd treat it as random vandalism, knowing no evidence would ever surface linking Brock to the crime. Instead, he made a mental note to stop keeping anything important in his locker, to carry everything he needed with him, to eliminate vulnerabilities. His grandfather would have called it tactical thinking, adapting strategy based on enemy capabilities. Thad just thought of it as survival. That afternoon, Piper waited by his locker after final bell with an expression that suggested she'd heard about the break-in. "They're pushing harder," she observed without preamble, "testing to see if you'll finally react." "I know," Thad confirmed, gathering his books and closing the damaged locker door that wouldn't properly latch anymore. "It's a pattern. Escalate until the target either breaks or fights back, then use that reaction as justification for further action." "So, what are you going to do?" Piper asked, falling into step beside him as they navigated toward the parking lot where her car waited. The afternoon sun hung low and pale in the winter sky, temperature dropping fast as evening approached. "Same thing I've been doing," Thad said, though the words tasted like surrender even as he spoke them. "Keep my head down, avoid confrontation, don't give them ammunition." Piper stopped walking, forcing Thad to stop as well, and fixed him with a look that mixed frustration and something that might have been concern. "Thad, they don't need ammunition. They're creating it, and at some point constant restraint stops being admirable and just becomes letting them win." Her words hit harder than Thad wanted to acknowledge, perhaps because they echoed thoughts he'd been trying to suppress for weeks. His grandfather had taught him that violence should always be a last resort, but the old man had also taught him never to accept victimhood, never to let someone break him down without resistance. Thad wasn't sure anymore where the line fell between honorable restraint and enabling abuse. "I made a promise," he said quietly, the admission feeling like exposing raw nerve. "To my grandfather before he died. That I'd never lose control again, never use my training to hurt someone out of anger." "There's a difference between losing control and defending yourself," Piper countered gently. "Your grandfather would understand that. Would he really want you getting hurt just to keep a promise that maybe doesn't apply to this situation?" Thad didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure his grandfather would have distinguished between justified self-defense and the kind of explosive violence that had sent Connor Michaels to the hospital. They'd never had that conversation. The old man had died before Thad could ask whether the promise had been absolute or contextual, whether there were exceptions or only failure. "I don't know," Thad admitted finally, "but I'm scared of what happens if I do fight back. Not scared of them, but scared of me, of what I might do if I stop holding back." Understanding dawned in Piper's expression, and she nodded slowly. "Okay, I get that. But promise me something. If it escalates to where you're actually getting hurt, where it's dangerous, you'll tell someone. Your mom, Principal Morrison, the police, someone. Don't martyr yourself for a promise to someone who isn't here to see the full situation." Thad promised, knowing even as he did that he probably wouldn't follow through, that his inability to ask for help was woven too deeply into his identity to overcome with simple determination. They walked the rest of the way to Piper's car in contemplative silence, and she drove him home without pressing the conversation further. As Thad walked up the driveway to his house, his mother's car already parked in the garage, he felt the weight of impossible choices settling across his shoulders like a physical burden. Thanksgiving week brought a welcome break from school. 5 days without having to navigate Lincoln High School's hostile hallways. Thad spent the time helping his mother prepare for their small holiday dinner, just the two of them, his grandmother too frail to travel from Portland, and lost himself in the familiar rhythms of cooking and cleaning and pretending their small, fractured family was whole. He trained hard in the basement gym, pushing his body to exhaustion that left no energy for anxiety or second-guessing. His mother asked about school and friends, and Thad painted pictures of normalcy that were only partially fictional, mentioned Piper and Jordan and the group chat without explaining the context of isolation that made their friendship necessary. When classes resumed the following Monday, Thad walked through Lincoln High School's main entrance with renewed dread, aware that the week-long break had probably provided Brock and his crew time to plan something. He made it through the morning without incident, began to hope he'd miscalculated their motivation, And then lunchtime arrived, and Thad understood he'd been very wrong. He'd been walking toward the cafeteria, planning to meet Piper and the others at their usual table, when someone, Kyle, he thought, stuck out a foot and sent him sprawling forward onto the hallway floor. The fall itself was familiar enough, but this time, as Thad pushed himself upright, he felt something wet and cold spread across his back. He reached over his shoulder to find his shirt soaked through with what smelled like milk, and looked up to find Travis standing over him, holding an empty carton with a grin that suggested this had been planned rather than spontaneous. "Oh man, my hand slipped," Travis said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "So sorry, Crane." "That's really unfortunate." Laughter rippled through the hallway, and Thad felt humiliation burning in his chest as he realized he'd have to walk through the cafeteria soaked in milk, reeking, clearly the victim of deliberate harassment. He gathered his backpack and started to stand, but Brock stepped into his space, blocking his path, phone held up and recording. "You okay there, Crane?" Brock asked with exaggerated concern that dripped sarcasm. "Need me to get you some paper towels?" "Maybe a mop." Thad didn't respond, just tried to move around Brock toward the bathroom, where he could at least attempt to clean up. But Brock shifted to block him again. The hallway had grown crowded with students watching the scene unfold, many with phones out recording, and Thad felt trapped in a nightmare of public exposure with no escape. He looked past Brock and spotted Piper pushing through the crowd, her face flushed with anger. "Move, Brock," Piper demanded, positioning herself beside Thad with body language that radiated protective fury. "This is pathetic. You and your wannabe tough guy routine." Brock's smile widened, and Thad's stomach dropped as he realized Piper had just made herself a more active target. "Oh, hey, Piper," Brock said with false friendliness. "Didn't see you there." "You defending your boyfriend? That's sweet, really sweet. Tell me, does he need you to fight all his battles, or just most of them?" "He's not fighting because he's better than you," Piper shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut. "He's choosing not to waste energy on someone so desperate for attention they have to pick on people half their size just to feel important. What does that say about you?" The crowd's murmur changed quality. Some students clearly impressed by Piper's courage, others sensing this confrontation escalating beyond the usual harassment. Brock's expression hardened, his smile taking on a dangerous edge, and Thad felt fear clutch his chest, not for himself, but for Piper, who'd just challenged someone who didn't accept challenges gracefully. Travis and Kyle had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle that felt increasingly like a trap, and Thad realized this moment had been orchestrated, that they'd planned to draw Piper into defending him so they could target her more directly. "Better than me?" Brock repeated, his tone dropping from mockery to something colder. "That's interesting, because from where I'm standing, Crane's a coward who can't even defend himself, let alone his friends. And you've got terrible taste in men if you think that's attractive." "Oh, walk away, Piper," Thad said quietly, urgently, aware that his milk-soaked shirt and disheveled appearance undermined any authority his words might carry. "Just walk away. This isn't worth it." "Listen to him," Brock agreed, turning his attention fully to Piper in ways that made Thad's skin crawl with dread. "Crane knows his place. Question is, do you?" What happened next felt like slow motion and lightning fast simultaneously. Brock reached out and shoved Piper's shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, but forceful enough to assert dominance, a physical violation designed to humiliate and intimidate. Piper stumbled backward, more from surprise than impact, and something fundamental shifted in Thad's awareness. The hallway noise faded to white static, his vision narrowed to laser focus, and every muscle in his body tensed with purpose. He'd tolerated months of harassment, had absorbed countless humiliations, had honored his promise to his grandfather, even when it cost him dignity and safety. But watching Brock put hands on Piper crossed a line that Thad couldn't uncross, triggered something primal that transcended promises, made to dead men. Thad stepped forward, positioning himself between Brock and Piper with movement that was unconsciously tactical. Weight distributed evenly, hands loose at his sides but ready, posture straight in ways that subtly changed how he occupied space. "Don't touch her," Thad said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Whatever you want to do to me, fine, but leave her out of it." Brock's eyes widened slightly, apparently surprised by this first real sign of resistance from the kid who'd spent months as a passive victim. Then his expression hardened, and he stepped closer, invading Thad's personal space with aggressive confidence. "Or what, Crane? What are you going to do about it? You going to finally grow a spine?" The crowd had gone silent. Dozens of students watching this confrontation with breath held, phones recording every moment. Thad felt his training flooding his awareness, saw the openings in Brock's guard, calculated the precise angle and force required to drop the bigger boy with minimal effort, mapped the tactical landscape of the hallway, and positioned his weight to engage or disengage as needed. His grandfather's voice whispered through his consciousness, "You never start a fight, boy. But if someone else starts it, you finish it completely and conclusively. Mercy comes after, not during." But Thad also heard his grandmother's words from the funeral. "He wouldn't want you defined by violence, sweetie. He taught you to fight so you'd have the confidence never to need it." And he heard his mother's quiet plea the night before they'd moved to Denver. "This is your chance to start over, honey. Please, please don't throw it away." "I'm not going to fight you, Brock," Thad said clearly, the words costing him more than anyone watching could understand. "But I'm also not going to stand here and let you hurt my friend. So you need to back up and walk away." For a moment, Thad thought it might actually work. Thought Brock might recognize the shift in Thad's demeanor and decide this wasn't worth escalating. Then Brock smiled, slow and mean, and Thad knew with sick certainty that restraint was being interpreted as weakness, that his attempt at de-escalation had just failed completely. "You hear that?" Brock called out to Travis and Kyle, playing to the crowd. "Crane thinks he can tell me what to do. Thinks he's tough now because he's got a girlfriend to impress." He turned back to Thad, voice dropping to carry threat beneath the mockery. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize for wasting my time with your pathetic existence. Then you're going to walk away and never speak to me or my friends again. And maybe I'll let your little girlfriend here off easy." Thad felt Piper tense beside him, felt her preparing to say something that would only make this worse, and he put a hand on her arm to stop her. "It's okay," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off Brock. "I've got this." "You really don't," Brock said, and shoved Thad hard in the chest. The shove shouldn't have moved him. Thad's base was solid, his weight distributed properly, his core engaged. But he let himself stumble backward anyway, let Brock think the move had been effective, because starting a fight violated everything his grandfather had taught him and everything he'd promised. The crowd murmured, disappointment mixing with vindication that Crane remained exactly who they thought he was. Brock's smile widened triumphantly, and he turned to address his audience with arms spread wide. "See? That's what I—" Brock didn't finish the sentence because Piper lunged forward and shoved him back hard, her face flushed with fury that transcended caution. "Leave him alone, you self-important asshole!" Time seemed to fragment. Brock recovered from Piper's shove with expression twisting from surprise to rage. Travis and Kyle moved forward, flanking to contain this situation that had deviated from script. And Thad found himself at a crossroads, watching someone he cared about put herself in danger defending him, forced to choose between the promise he'd made to a dead man and the responsibility he owed to the living. The decision made itself. Thad stepped forward as Brock raised his hand toward Piper, closed the distance with speed that seemed to startle everyone watching, and caught Brock's wrist in mid-air with a grip that his Brazilian jiu-jitsu training had hardwired into muscle memory. "I said," Thad repeated quietly, Don't touch her. Brock tried to pull his arm free and discovered he couldn't, tried to use his other hand to break Thad's grip and found that equally ineffective. Confusion flashed across his face as the power dynamic shifted without warning, as the victim he'd been tormenting for months suddenly demonstrated capability that didn't match the carefully constructed narrative. "What the—" "Get off me, Crane!" Thad released Brock's wrist and stepped back, hands returning to neutral position, posture still radiating controlled readiness that hadn't been visible before today. "Walk away," Thad said clearly. "Please, just walk away, and this ends here." But Brock's pride couldn't accept that solution, couldn't tolerate this public challenge to his authority. His face flushed red with humiliation and anger, and he lunged forward with a wild punch aimed at Thad's face, the kind of telegraphed attack that wouldn't have landed on anyone with 3 weeks of training, much less someone with Thad's background. Thad slipped the punch with minimal movement, just angling his head 6 inches left, and the momentum of Brock's miss carried him stumbling past where Thad stood calmly waiting. The hallway erupted in shocked gasps and excited murmurs. Travis moved in to support his leader, throwing a looping right hook that Thad parried with his left forearm, redirecting the force past his body while simultaneously stepping offline so he was no longer between Travis and Kyle. His grandfather had drilled these principles endlessly. Never let yourself get caught between opponents. Create angles, maintain mobility, use their positioning against them. Brock recovered and charged again, this time trying to tackle Thad with the football techniques that had served him well on the field but were predictable as sunrise to someone with wrestling experience. Thad sprawled, dropping his hips and spreading his base, stopping Brock's forward momentum completely while maintaining his own balance. Then he pivoted, used Brock's committed weight against him, and guided the bigger boy past and down onto the floor with control that suggested technical mastery rather than lucky improvisation. The crowd's noise increased exponentially, shock and excitement and disbelief all mixing together. Phones were everywhere, recording from multiple angles, capturing footage that would be shared across social media within minutes. Thad backed away from where Brock lay on the floor looking stunned, gave him space to get up, made clear this wasn't about aggression or domination, but simply defense. "Please," Thad said again, breathing steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I don't want to do this. Just leave us alone." Brock pushed himself upright, face purple with rage and humiliation, and looked to Travis and Kyle, who were watching with expressions suggesting they were reconsidering their assumptions about Crane's capabilities. "Both of you!" Brock snarled. "Take him down!" Now, what happened next would be replayed thousands of times on social media, would become a case study in how trained skill overcomes size and numbers when applied with discipline and restraint. Travis came from Thad's left, while Kyle approached from the right, trying to overwhelm with coordinated attack that might have worked against someone untrained. But Thad had spent years practicing scenarios exactly like this. Multiple opponents, confined space, need to control without causing serious injury. He moved forward rather than back, violated their expectation by closing distance with Travis instead of retreating, used precise footwork his boxing coach had drilled into him endlessly. His left hand caught Travis's reaching arm, controlled the wrist, and Thad pivoted his body, using leverage and momentum to throw Travis off balance and redirect him into Kyle's path. Both boys collided, stumbled, and Thad was already resetting his position, weight on the balls of his feet, hands up in proper guard position that he'd maintained unconsciously. Kyle recovered first, threw a big overhand right that had power but no technique. Thad slipped inside the arc of the punch, too close for it to land with force, and drove his shoulder into Kyle's chest while wrapping his arms around Kyle's waist. For a moment, they were locked together, and then Thad executed a picture-perfect double-leg takedown that his wrestling coach would have given full marks, driving forward with his legs while lifting with his arms, controlled and technical. Kyle hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, and Thad immediately released him, stepped back, created distance. Travis had regained his feet and came again, more cautious this time, but Brock grabbed him by the shoulder. "Stop!" Brock said, his voice tight with fury and disbelief. "Just stop." The hallway had gone completely silent except for the sound of Kyle gasping for air and struggling to stand. Thad remained in his ready stance, but his expression held no triumph or mockery, just tired resignation and perhaps disappointment that it had come to this. Brock stared at him like seeing a stranger, trying to reconcile months of passive victimhood with the demonstrated competence of the last 60 seconds. "Where did that come from?" Brock demanded, and Thad heard genuine confusion beneath the anger. "You've been taking our shit for months without fighting back. You didn't even try to defend yourself. Why now?" "Because you touched her," Thad said simply, gesturing toward Piper, who stood frozen nearby with one hand over her mouth. "You could do whatever you wanted to me, and I'd take it because I made a promise about violence, but I never promised to stand by while someone hurts my friends." The distinction seemed lost on Brock, but Thad felt its weight settling across his shoulders, knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had broken the promise to his grandfather regardless of justification. Tears stung his eyes though he blinked them back, refused to cry in front of these people who'd caused him so much pain. A teacher's voice cut through the silence, sharp with authority and too late to matter. "What is going on here?" Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd of students, her expression shifting from anger to confusion as she took in the scene. Kyle on the floor, still catching his breath. Travis and Brock standing but clearly shaken. Thad alone in clear space with ready posture and controlled breathing, while dozens of phones captured everything. Someone better start explaining right now. "They attacked him," Piper said immediately, stepping forward before anyone else could speak. "Brock shoved me, and Thad told him to stop, and then they attacked him. Everybody saw it. There's probably 50 videos already posted online." Mrs. Henderson's expression suggested she knew this would mean paperwork and parent phone calls and administrative headaches, but also that she couldn't ignore what had obviously been a major altercation. "Principal Morrison's office. All of you. Now." She turned to address the watching students. "Everyone else, get to class. Show's over, and put those phones away before I start collecting them." The crowd dispersed reluctantly, students heading toward the cafeteria and classrooms, while casting backward glances and whispering excitedly. Thad lowered his hands, let his posture return to normal, and felt exhaustion crash over him like a wave. Piper appeared at his elbow, her eyes wet with tears she hadn't let fall. "Thad, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pushed him. I made it worse." "You didn't make anything worse," Thad said quietly as they followed Mrs. Henderson toward the administrative offices, with Brock and his friends trailing behind. This was always going to happen eventually. They weren't going to stop. Principal Morrison's office smelled of coffee and stress, the walls decorated with framed diplomas and photos of Morrison shaking hands with various important-looking people. The principal himself sat behind a large wooden desk, late 50s, with receding hairline and expression of permanent exhaustion, and listened with increasing dismay as Mrs. Henderson explained what she'd witnessed. Thad and Piper sat in chairs against one wall, while Brock, Travis and Kyle occupied the opposite side, nobody making eye contact. "So, let me see if I understand," Morrison said after Henderson finished her summary. There was a physical altercation in the hallway involving 5 students, with dozens of witnesses and multiple recordings. And somehow, nobody thought to come to me or any other administrator before it escalated to violence. The question hung in the air, rhetorical but loaded with implications. Thad almost laughed at the absurdity, as if anyone had been hiding this harassment from administration, as if Morrison hadn't been deliberately ignoring the pattern for months, because addressing it would mean acknowledging his school had problems. but he held his tongue, aware that anything he said now could be used to assign blame. "Crane started it," Brock said suddenly, voice carrying wounded indignation. "He grabbed my wrist first. That's assault. There are witnesses." "After you reached toward Piper," Thad countered quietly, keeping his tone level despite the spike of anger in his chest. "After you'd spent months harassing me, stealing my property, publicly humiliating me, and organizing your friends to physically intimidate me on a daily basis." "Yeah, I grabbed your wrist to prevent you from touching her. That's called defending someone." Morrison's expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else dealing with any other problem. "We have a zero-tolerance policy toward violence at Lincoln High School. Any student involved in a physical altercation faces automatic 3-day suspension." "Even in self-defense?" Piper asked incredulously. "Even when there's video evidence showing Thad being attacked and only defending himself?" "The policy doesn't make exceptions based on who started it," Morrison said, with the tired recitation of someone who'd given this speech many times. "We have to treat all violence equally, otherwise we end up making judgment calls about who deserves what consequences, and that's a legal nightmare." Thad felt defeat settling into his bones, the certainty that this system was rigged against victims who fought back while rewarding bullies who stayed just inside the boundaries of plausible deniability. His grandfather would have had words for Morrison, hard words delivered with Marine Corps directness. But his grandfather wasn't here, and Thad was alone, except for Piper's loyalty. "So, you're saying," Thad spoke carefully, "that I should have just let Brock and his friends assault me without defending myself. That's your official position." "I'm saying that violence is never the answer," Morrison replied, the platitude meaningless in context. "There are proper channels for addressing bullying concerns." "I tried those channels," Thad interrupted, frustration finally breaking through his careful control. "I reported the locker vandalism. I told Mrs. Chen about the harassment in English class. I've spent 2 months being a model student who doesn't fight back or cause problems, and all that happened was Brock and his friends got more aggressive because they knew there wouldn't be consequences. So please, sir, explain what the proper channel was that I missed." Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to recognize he was on shaky ground with this line of defense. "I'll need to review the video evidence and interview witnesses before making final determination about consequences. In the meantime, all 5 of you are suspended pending investigation. I'll be calling your parents to pick you up." The rest of the afternoon blurred into a nightmare of phone calls and forced waiting, sitting in the administrative office while Morrison made calls and Thad's mother's voice echoed through the receiver expressing confusion and worry. When she arrived an hour later, face pinched with stress, Thad felt guilt crash over him in waves. They'd moved to Denver specifically to give him a fresh start, and here he was suspended for fighting barely 3 months into the school year. "What happened?" his mother asked once they were in the car, pulling out of Lincoln High School's parking lot with hands tight on the steering wheel. Principal Morrison said something about a fight, but he wasn't very clear on the details. Thad explained the situation as factually as possible. Months of harassment, the escalation, Brock pushing Piper, the choice Thad had made to finally defend someone he cared about. His mother listened in silence, her expression cycling through anger and worry and something that might have been resignation. When he finished, she was quiet for several long moments. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she said finally, and Thad felt tears burning his eyes at the unexpected absolution. "He taught you to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Yes, he also taught you to avoid violence when possible, but he wasn't naive enough to think that would always work. And he definitely wouldn't want you letting someone hurt your friend just to keep a promise about your own safety." "I broke my promise to him," Thad said quietly, the words hurting to speak. "I lost control." "You didn't lose control," his mother corrected firmly, turning onto their residential street. You made a conscious decision to defend someone, and from what you've described, you showed remarkable restraint even while doing it. That's not the same thing as what happened in Portland, Thad. Not even close." Her words loosened something in his chest that had been wound tight for months, but Thad still felt the weight of consequence pressing down. "I'm suspended. Morrison might expel me, and Brock's dad is rich enough to cause real problems if he wants to." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," his mother said, pulling into their driveway and putting the car in park. "But right now, I need you to understand something. I am not disappointed in you. I'm not angry. What I am is sorry that I didn't realize how bad things had gotten, that you felt like you had to handle this alone, because moving here was supposed to fix everything." They sat in the car for a long time, talking through everything Thad had been carrying alone. The daily harassment, the isolation, the impossible calculus of trying to honor his grandfather's memory while maintaining his own dignity. His mother listened and asked questions, and admitted she'd been so focused on making ends meet financially that she'd missed signs of her son struggling emotionally. By the time they went inside, Thad felt lighter despite the uncertain consequences ahead. The 3-day suspension stretched before Thad like a prison sentence, time to think and worry and refresh social media obsessively to see how the hallway confrontation was being discussed. The videos had gone viral, not just within Lincoln High School, but across district schools and beyond, shared thousands of times with commentary that ranged from supportive, "This kid showed amazing restraint," to critical, "Why didn't he just walk away?" to mocking, "Bro thought he was in a movie." Thad's name trended locally on Twitter, strangers debating his choices without knowing any context, reducing his months of suffering to a 60-second clip that started mid-confrontation. But something unexpected happened alongside the viral spread. Students from Lincoln High School, who'd witnessed months of Brock's harassment, began sharing their own videos and stories, adding context that painted a very different picture from the simple school fight narrative. Someone posted a compilation of clips showing Thad being pushed around over weeks and weeks, never retaliating. Another student wrote a long thread explaining the pattern of escalation and administration's failure to intervene. A girl Thad barely knew recorded a video testimony about watching Brock steal his gym bag and administration refusing to investigate. Public opinion began to shift as evidence accumulated. Local news picked up the story, interviewed students who confirmed the harassment, asked Principal Morrison pointed questions about the school's anti-bullying policies that he struggled to answer convincingly. By Wednesday evening, Lincoln High School's social media accounts were flooded with criticism about how they'd handled the situation, parents demanding accountability, and Morrison found himself managing a public relations nightmare. Piper texted throughout the suspension, keeping Thad updated on school dynamics and sending screenshots of supportive messages. "You're basically a legend now," she wrote Tuesday afternoon. "Half the school is wearing Team Crane shirts that somebody made overnight. Jordan bought 3. Thursday morning, Thad's mother received a call from Principal Morrison requesting she and Thad come to the school for a meeting. They arrived to find not just Morrison, but also the district superintendent, a lawyer Thad's mother had contacted just in case, and representatives from a local advocacy group that worked on bullying prevention. The meeting room felt crowded and tense, everyone positioning their legal obligations carefully. The outcome surprised Thad more than he wanted to admit. After reviewing extensive video evidence and interviewing dozens of witnesses, the district had determined that while Thad had violated technical policy by engaging in physical contact, the circumstances clearly supported self-defense and defense of another student. His suspension would remain on his record, but would be reduced from 3 days to 1, Brock Sterling, Kyle Hendricks, and Travis Connolly would face lengthier suspensions, mandatory counseling, and social probation that prohibited them from participating in athletics pending completion of their consequences. "We recognize that our policies failed you, Mr. Crane," the superintendent said with carefully practiced remorse. "And we're implementing new protocols to ensure better monitoring and intervention when harassment patterns are reported. You should never have been put in a position where physical defense felt like your only option." The apology felt hollow, bureaucratic ass-covering more than genuine accountability. But Thad accepted it because fighting institutional inertia seemed even more exhausting than surviving Brock's harassment. He returned to Lincoln High School on Friday morning to find the social landscape completely transformed. Students who'd ignored him for months now greeted him in hallways, some apologizing for their passivity, others expressing admiration for his restraint and courage. His locker, repaired by maintenance, became a gathering point where people stopped to talk or leave supportive notes. Piper met him at the entrance with a hug that lasted longer than strictly necessary, relief evident in her expression. "Thank God. I was worried they'd try to expel you and blame the whole thing on you fighting back." "They probably wanted to," Thad admitted as they walked toward first-period calculus together. "But there was too much evidence, too many witnesses confirming what actually happened. Hard to maintain the both sides narrative when 50 people recorded the same events." Lunch that day felt surreal. Thad sat with Piper and their usual group at the table by the windows, but now other students kept stopping by to express support or share their own experiences with bullying. Some wanted to shake his hand, others just wanted him to know he wasn't alone, and Thad felt overwhelmed by the sudden visibility after months of desperate invisibility. Maya's band t-shirt had been replaced with one of the Team Crane shirts Piper had mentioned. Jordan kept showing him supportive comments on social media, and Chris asked if he could paint Thad's portrait for his advanced art project focused on modern courage. Across the cafeteria, Brock's usual table sat conspicuously empty, the social hierarchy that had seemed so solid now revealed as fragile. Travis and Kyle ate lunch at separate tables, isolated from each other and from the teams they'd belonged to, learning firsthand how quickly status could evaporate. Thad felt neither satisfaction nor pity watching their fall, just tired recognition that cycles of dominance and victimhood often reversed without fundamentally changing the underlying system. The following Monday, Thad was walking between classes when someone fell into step beside him, Brock Sterling, looking smaller somehow despite unchanged physical dimensions. His usual confidence had been replaced by uncertainty, his body language lacking the aggressive assertion that had characterized every previous interaction. "Crane," he said quietly, "can we talk?" Thad's first instinct was refusal, but curiosity won out over wariness. They stepped into an empty classroom, and Brock closed the door with visible discomfort. For several long moments neither spoke, the silence heavy with months of accumulated antagonism. Finally, Brock cleared his throat and met Thad's eyes, looking younger and more vulnerable than Thad had ever seen him. "I'm sorry," Brock said, the words clearly costing him significant pride. "For everything, the harassment, the humiliation, turning the whole school against you. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong while I was doing it, but I did it anyway, because—" He trailed off, struggling to articulate motivation. He maybe didn't fully understand himself. "Because you could," Thad finished for him. "Because it made you feel powerful to push someone around who wouldn't fight back." "Yeah," Brock admitted, staring at the floor. "And because things are shit at home, and my dad has these expectations about who I should be, and taking it out on someone else felt easier than dealing with my own problems. I know that's not an excuse. It's not. But I wanted you to understand that it wasn't really about you, specifically. You just represented things I was angry about." Thad considered Brock's words, weighed them against months of suffering, tried to access compassion he wasn't sure he possessed. You broke into my locker, stole my property, orchestrated public humiliation, designed to isolate me from everyone at this school. You didn't accidentally hurt me. You systematically targeted me for destruction, and you did it while convincing yourself it was somehow justified or not that serious. I know, Brock said quietly, still not meeting Thad's eyes. I've been thinking about it a lot since the suspension. About how it must have felt from your perspective, showing up to a new school and immediately becoming someone's target for no reason you could control. If our positions had been reversed, I don't think I would have handled it as well as you did. The admission surprised Thad, not the apology itself, which felt somewhat performative, but the evidence that Brock had actually reflected on perspective beyond his own. What do you want from me? Thad asked bluntly. Forgiveness? Some guarantee I won't come after you now that everyone knows I can fight? I don't know, Brock said honestly. Maybe just to say it out loud to your face. That I'm sorry, that I was wrong, that if I could take it back I would. Not because I got caught or punished, but because I genuinely regret hurting you. Thad studied Brock's expression, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but found only what appeared to be genuine remorse mixed with shame. He thought about his grandfather's teachings regarding mercy and second chances, about the man's belief that people could change if they chose to do the work. I accept your apology, Thad said finally, but that doesn't mean we're friends. It means I acknowledge you're capable of recognizing you did wrong and feeling bad about it. What you do with that recognition is up to you. Fair enough, Brock agreed, looking relieved to have gotten through the conversation. For what it's worth, you could have really hurt us in that hallway. Travis and Kyle keep talking about how controlled you were, how you were clearly trained but chose not to seriously injure anyone. That takes... I don't know what that takes, but it's more than I would have managed in your position. After Brock left, Thad sat in the empty classroom for several minutes processing the interaction. His grandfather had always emphasized that true strength included knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, that violence should always be a tool of last resort. Thad had spent months trying to avoid fighting, had absorbed abuse and humiliation in service of a promise, but when someone he cared about needed protection, he'd acted decisively while still maintaining control. Perhaps that was what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Not that violence was categorically wrong, but that it required wisdom to know when its use was justified. The remainder of November and early December passed with remarkable normality, as if the confrontation had lanced some poisonous wound in Lincoln High School's social body. Brock kept his distance, nodded acknowledgement when they passed in hallways, but made no attempt at friendship. Travis and Kyle seemed diminished somehow, their status within school hierarchy permanently damaged. Other potential bullies apparently took note of consequences and adjusted their behavior accordingly, leading to a noticeable reduction in the casual cruelty that had characterized the school's culture. Thad's relationship with Piper deepened naturally, conversations growing more personal and vulnerable as trust accumulated. They studied together in the library, exchanged increasingly lengthy text messages late into the evening, found excuses to spend time together beyond the school environment. One Saturday in early December, Piper invited Thad to watch her play guitar at a small coffee house where Maya's band was performing, and Thad sat in the audience feeling his chest expand with something that felt startlingly like happiness. After the show, they walked through downtown Denver's holiday-lit streets while December cold turned their breath to vapor, and Piper talked about her plans for college and dreams of traveling and fears that she wasn't talented enough to make it as a musician. Thad listened and shared his own uncertainties about the future, his desire to study engineering but worry that he lacked the confidence or social skills to thrive in that competitive environment. The conversation flowed easily, two people learning each other's internal landscapes without performance or pretense. "Can I ask you something?" Piper said as they reached her car parked near the coffee house. "About that day in the hallway. Why did you finally fight back? Not that I'm criticizing. I'm glad you did. But you'd taken so much worse before that. What made that moment different?" Thad thought about his answer carefully, wanting to articulate something he'd barely processed himself. "Because it wasn't about me anymore. I could take whatever they wanted to do to me. I had reasons for that, promises I'd made, things I was trying to prove. But watching Brock put hands on you, knowing he was escalating because you'd defended me, I couldn't stand by for that. Some things are worth breaking promises for." Piper looked at him for a long moment, and then kissed him, quick and soft, there and gone before Thad could really process it was happening. His heart hammered in his chest, his face flushed with surprise and embarrassment and something warmer, and Piper smiled at his obvious fluster. "I'm glad we're friends, Thad Crane. Really glad." "Me too," Thad managed, aware he probably sounded ridiculous but unable to construct more eloquent response. They stood in the cold evening air grinning at each other like idiots, and Thad felt lighter than he had in months, felt the accumulated weight of fear and shame and isolation beginning to lift. Christmas break arrived with relief and celebration, 2 weeks away from school obligations. Thad spent the holidays helping his mother decorate their modest house, video calling with his grandmother in Portland, and training in the basement gym with renewed commitment to the discipline his grandfather had taught him. He'd proven to himself that he could defend himself and others when necessary while still maintaining control and restraint. That the promise he'd made hadn't been about never fighting, but about never losing himself to violence the way he had in Portland. When classes resumed in January, Thad walked through Lincoln High School's main entrance with confidence he'd spent months building through trial and suffering. Students greeted him warmly, teachers acknowledged him with respect, and the hallways that had felt like hostile territory now seemed navigable, sometimes even welcoming. He'd earned this transformation through patience and courage, and the willingness to stand up when it mattered most, and he felt pride in that accomplishment tempered by awareness of the cost. One afternoon in late January, Thad was studying in the library during free period when he noticed a freshman sitting alone at a corner table, shoulders hunched, clearly trying to be invisible in ways Thad recognized viscerally. The boy looked small for his age, wore clothes that were slightly too large and maybe not quite clean, and radiated the particular vulnerability that attracted predators. Thad watched for several minutes as two sophomores approached the freshman's table, said something that made the boy flinch, and laughed as they knocked his books onto the floor before walking away. The scene was painfully familiar, and Thad found himself standing and crossing the library before conscious decision had been made. He gathered the scattered books and set them on the table, then slid into the chair across from the freshman, who looked up with wary suspicion. "I'm Thad," he said simply. "You okay?" "Fine," the boy mumbled, clearly not fine, not trusting this unexpected intervention. "Just clumsy." "Those guys shoved your stuff deliberately," Thad observed gently. "I saw it happen. That's not you being clumsy. That's them being assholes." The freshman's eyes widened slightly, apparently surprised by directness. "Yeah, well, what am I supposed to do about it? They're bigger than me." "Tell someone," Thad suggested, knowing even as he said it that the advice was insufficient. "Teacher, counselor, someone who can actually do something, but more importantly, don't let them make you invisible. Eat lunch with other people, find friends who'll have your back, stay visible in ways that make it harder for them to isolate you." "Easy for you to say," the freshman muttered, but with less hostility. "You're not the one getting pushed around." "I was," Thad said quietly. "First semester. Different people, but same situation. It sucked, and I handled it by trying to disappear, which only made things worse. So I'm telling you what I wish someone had told me. You don't have to handle this alone." They talked for the remainder of the period, Thad sharing strategy and perspective while carefully avoiding the more dramatic parts of his own story. When the bell rang, the freshman looked less hunched, less defeated, and accepted Thad's offer to exchange phone numbers. "Text me if those guys escalate," Thad said, "or if you just need someone to eat lunch with." The cafeteria's way less intimidating with backup. Walking to his next class, Thad felt something settle into place. Understanding that survival wasn't the end point, but rather the foundation for helping others survive. His grandfather had taught him to fight not for dominance but for protection, and protecting others was how he'd honor that legacy. The promise he'd made at the funeral hadn't been broken by defending Piper, it had been fulfilled, proven meaningful through the choice to use his training judiciously, rather than avoid using it entirely. February brought Valentine's Day and the formalization of Thad's relationship with Piper, who asked him with characteristic directness if he wanted to be her boyfriend or if she'd been misreading the situation. Thad, blushing furiously, confirmed he very much wanted that, and they spent the evening at an Italian restaurant downtown talking about everything and nothing while snow fell outside the windows. Piper told him about her parents' divorce and her struggles with anxiety, and Thad shared more about his grandfather's death and the incident in Portland that had driven his family to Denver. Vulnerability built intimacy, and by the time Thad walked Piper to her car, they'd established foundation for something that felt substantial, lasting. March brought warmer weather and longer days, the school year sliding toward its conclusion with increasing momentum. Thad maintained solid grades, spent lunchtimes with Piper and their friend group, and continued training in his basement gym with discipline his grandfather would have approved. The freshman he'd helped in the library, Michael his name turned out to be, became a regular at their lunch table, gradually shedding his defensive posture as he found community and acceptance. One afternoon in early April, Thad was walking to his car after final bell when he encountered Brock near the parking lot, the first time they'd spoken since their conversation in the empty classroom. Brock looked different somehow, less physically imposing though his dimensions hadn't changed, carrying himself with less aggressive assertion. "Crane," he said, then seemed to struggle with how to continue. "Listen, I wanted you to know. I've been doing the counseling the school required, working through some stuff with a therapist my mum found. And I've been thinking a lot about what I put you through." "Okay," Thad said neutrally, unsure where this was headed. "I can't undo it," Brock continued, words coming faster as if rehearsed. "I can't take back the months of making your life hell, can't erase the videos or the humiliation or any of it. But I've been trying to do better, apologized to some other people I've been shitty to over the years, called out a couple teammates who were starting to target a sophomore. Small stuff, but it's something." Thad studied Brock's expression and saw something that looked like genuine growth, the painful kind that came from confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself. "That's good," he said finally. "Change starts with recognizing the harm you caused and choosing different behavior. I'm glad you're doing that work. Would you—" Brock hesitated, then pushed forward. "Would you ever consider grabbing coffee or something? Not as friends necessarily, but just to talk. I think maybe I could learn some things from how you handled the situation, how you kept your shit together when I was doing everything I could to break you down." The request surprised Thad, and he took a moment to consider it. His grandfather had believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption for those willing to do the difficult work of changing. "Maybe," Thad said carefully. "Let me think about it." I appreciate you asking instead of assuming." They parted with cordial nods, and Thad drove home through Denver's sprawling streets, thinking about forgiveness and accountability and the strange ways people's lives intersected. He'd come to Lincoln High School hoping to be invisible, to escape the reputation that had followed him from Portland, and instead had been forced into visibility through suffering and eventual defense. But that forced visibility had led to genuine friendship with Piper and her group, had revealed capacities for courage and restraint he hadn't known he possessed, had ultimately transformed the school's culture in ways that benefited vulnerable students beyond himself. By May, with graduation approaching for seniors and final exams looming for everyone else, Lincoln High School felt different than it had in October. Not perfect. Nowhere was perfect, and casual cruelty still existed in small, insidious ways, but noticeably better. Students intervened more quickly when they saw harassment. Teachers responded more seriously to reports of bullying, and administration had implemented new protocols that created actual consequences for sustained intimidation. Thad wasn't naive enough to think his confrontation with Brock had single-handedly fixed the system, but he recognized that sometimes individual courage could catalyze broader cultural shifts. The last day of the school year arrived with unseasonable heat, temperatures climbing into the 90s as students cleared out lockers and exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch over summer. Thad stood near the main entrance with Piper, watching the chaos of the final dismissal, and felt bittersweet awareness that this chapter was closing. He'd arrived at Lincoln High School broken and scared and desperate to disappear, and was leaving with friends and dignity and hard-won understanding of his own capabilities. "You know what I keep thinking about," Piper said, leaning against the wall beside him while students streamed past toward the parking lot. "That video of the hallway confrontation. It's been viewed like 2 million times now, and the comments are still arguing about whether you should have fought back sooner, or whether you showed perfect restraint, or whether violence is ever justified. But I don't think most people watching really understand what it cost you to handle it the way you did." "What do you mean?" Thad asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I mean, everyone focuses on the 60 seconds of actual confrontation," Piper explained, "but nobody talks about the months before that. All the times you walked away when you could have fought. All the humiliation you absorbed while staying committed to a promise you'd made to someone you loved. The discipline required to have those skills and not use them even when you had every provocation. That's the real story, not the fight itself, but everything you did to avoid fighting until avoiding it meant abandoning your principles." Thad felt his throat tighten with emotion, struck by how completely Piper understood the moral complexity he'd been navigating. "My grandfather used to say that anyone can throw a punch, but it takes real strength to know when not to. I didn't fully understand what he meant until this year." And they stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Piper took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I'm really glad you transferred here, Thad Crane. Even though it was terrible for you at first. Is that selfish?" "Maybe a little," Thad admitted with a smile, "but I'm glad too. This year was hard, but it also taught me things about myself I needed to learn. About finding the balance between peace and power, about protecting others without losing myself to violence, about the difference between being passive and being patient." As they walked toward the parking lot together, Thad found himself thinking about the freshman he'd befriended, Michael, who'd grown noticeably more confident over the semester, who'd made his own friends and no longer ate lunch alone. Thought about Brock, who'd been doing genuine work to address the insecurity and anger that had driven his cruelty. Thought about all the students at Lincoln High School who'd learned through observation and social media that bullying could have consequences, that victims sometimes possessed power they chose not to wield until necessary, that courage could manifest through restraint as much as action. His grandfather had believed that martial arts training existed to build character as much as capability, that the real test of a martial artist wasn't how well they could fight, but whether they had the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary. Thad had spent months failing that test, he'd thought, absorbing abuse without resistance, appearing weak to everyone, including himself. But maybe the real test had been the choice he made in that hallway, the decision to defend Piper while still maintaining control, to use his training judiciously rather than vindictively. That evening, Thad stood in his basement gym, running through forms with the fluid precision that came from years of dedicated practice. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. The combinations flowed without conscious thought, muscle memory deeper than words. His grandfather's voice echoed through his mind, patient and firm. "You don't train to fight, boy. You train so you don't have to. But if that day comes when you do have to, you'll be ready to do what's necessary while staying true to who you are." Thad had reached that day, had discovered in real time what necessary meant when someone you cared about was in danger. And he'd stayed true to himself, hadn't lost control or become the aggressor, had defended without destroying, had shown mercy when revenge would have been easier. The promise he'd made to his grandfather had been tested and proven flexible enough to accommodate ethical complexity, strong enough to guide without constraining. He finished his training and sat on the basement floor with sweat cooling on his skin, muscles pleasantly exhausted, mind finally quiet. His phone buzzed with messages from the group chat, Maya sharing photos from the last day of school, Jordan posting a countdown to summer break, Alexis announcing a party at her house next weekend. Piper sent a private text. "Thanks for walking me to my car today. See you tomorrow." Thad responded affirmatively and allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since before his grandfather's death. Contentment with who he was becoming, confidence that the difficult journey had been worthwhile. He'd arrived in Denver hoping to escape his past, had instead been forced to confront it and integrate its lessons into a more complex understanding of strength and restraint. The year at Lincoln High School had been brutal in many ways, but it had also been transformative in ways he couldn't have predicted or planned. As summer stretched ahead full of possibility, Thad thought about the future with cautious optimism. College applications would come next year, opportunities to continue building the life his grandfather had wanted for him. Disciplined, purposeful, strong enough to protect others without becoming what he fought against. The training would continue, the discipline would remain, but now tempered with practical wisdom about when and how to apply those skills. He climbed the basement stairs to find his mother in the kitchen preparing dinner, and joined her with easy conversation about plans for summer and whether they should visit his grandmother in Portland. Life moved forward, carrying him with it toward unknown futures, but Thad felt ready now in ways he hadn't at the school year's beginning. He'd been tested and found himself capable, but also merciful, powerful but also controlled, willing to fight when necessary, but always defaulting toward peace. That was his grandfather's real legacy, not the technical skills or physical conditioning, but the moral framework that transformed martial arts from violence into something approaching wisdom. Thad would carry that legacy forward into whatever came next, would honor it through his choices rather than through passive non-action. The promise hadn't been broken. It had evolved to accommodate the messy reality of a world where sometimes you had to stand up and sometimes you had to know when to stop. Standing in the kitchen with his mother while evening light faded outside the windows, Thad felt the accumulated weight of the school year beginning to lift. He'd survived, had found friends and love and self-respect in the process, had transformed from victim to example without losing his humanity along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that he'd faced his test and passed it, had proven himself worthy of his grandfather's faith while also forging his own path forward. The journey had been hard, but worthwhile. The scars would remain, but they'd become part of his story rather than defining it completely. And most importantly, Thad understood now that true strength wasn't about domination or fear or the ability to hurt others. It was about having the power to inflict harm and choosing instead to protect, to defend, to show mercy even when mercy wasn't deserved. His grandfather would have been proud. Thad was finally beginning to be proud of himself. And that, more than any confrontation or viral video or social redemption, was the real victory of his time at Lincoln High School. He'd found himself in the process of defending others, had discovered that his capacity for controlled violence could coexist with his commitment to peace, had learned the hard lesson that sometimes you had to break promises to honor deeper principles. The bullies had tried to film him crying, had tried to capture his humiliation for viral entertainment. Instead, they'd recorded their own defeat and broadcast evidence of their cruelty to the world. Justice wasn't always perfect or immediate, but sometimes it arrived in unexpected forms, in viral videos and cultural shifts, in individual courage that inspired others to be brave, in the recognition that passive victims sometimes possessed power they simply chose not to wield until circumstances demanded it. And in the end, that was the story Thad wanted to tell. Not that he'd won a fight, but that he'd maintained his principles while doing what was necessary to protect someone he loved. Not that he was invincible, but that he'd survived and helped others survive. Not that violence solved problems, but that sometimes standing up was the only ethical choice, even when it meant breaking promises to dead men who'd taught you to fight precisely so you'd know when not to. The clip had gone viral for the wrong reason from Brock's perspective, but perhaps for exactly the right reason from the universe's perspective. A reminder that bullies could be challenged, that victims possessed power, that mercy was stronger than revenge, and that true strength included the wisdom to know when to fight and when to stop. Thad carried these lessons forward into summer and whatever lay beyond, confident that his grandfather's legacy lived on, not in the techniques themselves, but in how and when and why he chose to use them. The year had transformed him from a scared kid trying to be invisible into someone comfortable in his own power, capable of defending without destroying, strong enough to show mercy when others expected violence. That was the real reckoning, not in the hallway confrontation that had been filmed and shared, but in the choice he made every day afterward to be better than his circumstances, kinder than his experiences, more merciful than those who'd hurt him. Brock and his friends had tried to break Thad down, had instead revealed depths of character and capability that Thad himself hadn't fully known he possessed. And for that unintended gift, in a strange way, Thad was almost grateful. Almost, but not quite. Some scars didn't need reframing or gratitude. They just needed acknowledgement and careful tending until they healed into reminders rather than open wounds. Thad would carry his scars forward alongside his growth, neither dismissing the pain nor being defined by it, finding the balance between remembering and moving forward that characterized mature survival. As night fell outside and dinner filled the kitchen with warm smells and warmer conversation, Thad felt something like peace settling over him. Not the absence of struggle or the guarantee of easy futures, but the deeper peace that came from knowing yourself and accepting both capacity and limitation. He was Thaddeus Crane, trained martial artist, dedicated student, loyal friend, protective boyfriend, survivor of targeted harassment who'd maintained his principles while ultimately defending what mattered most. That was enough. That was more than enough. And tomorrow, when he woke to summer sunlight and messages from Piper and plans with Jordan and all the ordinary, extraordinary details of a life reclaimed, Thad would continue building on that foundation. The reckoning had come, had been survived, had transformed everyone involved in ways both obvious and subtle. And the clip that had gone viral would remain online as evidence, not of victory or defeat in any simple sense, but of the complex moral landscape that teenagers navigated daily, of the choices that defined character, of the difference between having power and using it wisely. Let strangers watch and judge and debate the ethics of his choices. Thad knew in his bones that he'd done the best he could under impossible circumstances, had honored both his grandfather's memory and his own emerging understanding of what strength really meant. That knowledge would carry him forward into whatever came next, armor against future challenges, proof that he could survive hard things while remaining fundamentally himself. The bullies had tried to destroy him, had tried to capture his destruction for entertainment, had instead documented their own moral bankruptcy for the world to witness. In the end, that was its own perfect justice, its own form of reckoning. And Thad could live with that, could even, in time, find peace with it. The year at Lincoln High School had cost him dearly, but also given him gifts he couldn't have obtained any other way. Knowledge of himself, capacity for measured force, understanding that sometimes you had to stand up, even when standing up meant breaking promises to protect principles that mattered more. His grandfather would understand. Thad was finally beginning to understand too, and that was enough to build on as summer stretched ahead full of promise and possibility, and the chance to simply be young without constant vigilance. He'd earned that chance, had paid for it in humiliation and restraint, and ultimately in the courage to defend what mattered most. The reckoning was complete, the transformation was underway, and Thaddeus Crane was ready for whatever came next, stronger and wiser for having survived his trial by fire while maintaining the core of who he'd always been. The bullies had lost, Thad had won, and most importantly, he'd won without losing himself in the process. That was the real victory, the meaningful triumph, the lesson his grandfather had been teaching him all along. You could be powerful without being cruel, strong without being aggressive, capable of violence while defaulting toward peace. That balance, difficult, constantly requiring recalibration, never perfect, was what separated warriors from bullies, defense from aggression, justice from revenge. Thad had found that balance through trial and error, through suffering and eventual action, through the support of people who'd believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself, and he would carry it forward as his grandfather's truest legacy, the gift that transcended techniques or conditioning or any physical training, the gift of knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, the gift of power tempered by wisdom, the gift of strength that protected rather than dominated. That was the reckoning. That was the transformation. That was the real story behind the viral video and the hallway confrontation and the school year that had tested Thaddeus Crane and found him ultimately worthy of the name his grandfather had chosen for him all those years ago. Strong, capable, but most importantly, wise enough to use that strength only when necessary and always with restraint. The bullies had recorded their own defeat, and Thad had recorded, in his choices and actions and the person he was becoming, his grandfather's wisdom living on in the next generation. That was victory enough. That was more than victory enough. That was everything that mattered.